I love music and I've studied the brain. I met my wife wondering who was performing Chopin's first ballade in the 1960s go-go apartment house in which I lived while getting my PhD at UCLA's Brain Research Institute. She was wondering who was blasting Mahler's symphony on the hi-fi. Although brain science requires clever experiments as well as careful work, it requires no new paradigm breakthroughs to figure out how pitch and rhythm, even melody, are captured, encoded, and transmitted by the ear and auditory system. But to express all the complex dimensions of music, from enrapturing love songs to martial national anthems, and all the complex expressions of human emotions in response, is radically more challenging. How does the brain process sounds, transforming mechanical changes in air pressure into astonishing mental experiences we call music? How does music explore the intersection of neuroscience and what it means to be human? How do human brains make music? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. The Brain Music Challenge is this: how can the human brain enable the human mind with respect to music? For me, the first step is to discern relevant scientific fields or ways of thinking: cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, functional neuroanatomy, cross-cultural psychology. I find a cluster of experts in Southern California. I meet scientists from San Diego and Los Angeles, UCSD and UCLA. I begin by exploring the purpose of music with a cognitive neuroscientist who studies how brain sensory and motor systems cooperate to shape our perception of the world, John Iverson. John, music is a part of our lives. We take it for granted, but it's not logically imperative that sentient beings should be musical.
Right.
So why are we musical?
There's also some views about music, maybe that it played a more important role in the development of our species. One particular aspect of music is rhythm, and our ability to synchronize our actions together and to move together in time. There's the idea that really rhythm helped us become humans as a society. When you train to be a soldier, you do these endless drills. But that's not something we use in warfare anymore. So why is that? Going to a rave, the feeling of dancing together, feeling this common heartbeat. Mm-hmm. There's a great sense of unity that rhythm can build into us. Mm-hmm. But one idea is that through rhythmic communication, through that kind of bonding, that could have enabled us to build larger groups. So you have to ask, why is that? Why has it persisted? Every culture that we know has music, particularly music with a beat that enables us to synchronize our actions around that beat.
Is the beat more fundamental than the harmonies?
I think rhythm is the core. We exist in time as humans. We perceive things in time. So perceiving patterns of time is critical. And one of the ways that humans perceive patterns of time that's actually quite unique in the animal world is by organizing time in a cyclical fashion. We call this beat-based perception. The idea that when you listen to sounds, you can start to feel a pulse, a repeating pulse. And you can use that to then chunk up time in these repeating units. In Western music, we call this meter, okay, with the connotation that you're actually using this measuring stick for time. So we have this kind of measuring line for time that we use in Western music to comprehend musical timing. We have a series of beats, and around each beat, we kind of have a clustering of notes that we understand. Those notes go together with that beat. So that's the perceptual side, but in the action side, this idea of beat or pulse also animates all of our movements. I find that it's a very deep kind of way of forming connections. If we look at our primate relatives, they often have smallish groups on the order of 30 individuals, and when the group gets larger, there's certain tensions that form and they end up fracturing. But it could be that rhythm is a way to cohere larger and larger groups, that it's a way of working out these internal tensions. If you imagine having a big wild dance party, that's one way to form unity in a group. And if you look beyond that, we have national anthems these days, right? Music clearly helps us form identity and unity and things like that.
But how does it work? How does the brain create music?
Yeah, so one thing, the brain seems to really like music in the sense that when we listen to or make music, huge swaths of the brain light up, are involved.
Where, for example?
Well, for example, obviously the auditory cortex.
Right.
You know, we all know that from basic science that the sound goes into our ears, it's processed in the brainstem and goes up to the auditory system. And this is kind of a view of the brain that has been passed on. You can think of the brain as like a bouquet of flowers, that you've got the stalks, each leading to different flowers. So the auditory might be, you know, chrysanthemums. And then in the back we've got a lily for the visual. And these systems are fairly independent from each other. Over the last decade or two, that's been challenged, that idea of this separation of the senses. And we know that there are clear links between different senses, that there are auditory responses in the visual system and vice versa. So the interesting thing about music that helps us understand the brain is looking not just at different senses, but how sensation and action are linked together. We've got motor areas of the brain that are on the sides here. And you know that the right side controls the left half of the body and vice versa. A fundamental principle of the way the brain is organized is through topography. The different parts of the brain connect to different parts of the sensory surface, different parts of the body. Okay. When we listen to music, even if we're sitting perfectly still, there have been a number of studies in brain imaging that show that if we listen to music with a strong sense of rhythm, a strong beat, the motor system goes crazy. It lights up. The question is, well, okay, is that just reflecting the fact that beat makes us want to move? But we've asked the participant in our experiment, please don't move. So the brain is just busting to move, but we told them to suppress that. Or could that motor activity be playing a more central role in the very perception of music? Could it be that in our perception of music, and particularly rhythm, our perception of beat, we build up expectations for what's coming next in time. So in the brain, what is the source of that expectation? What is the source of that regular sense of timing, that regular pulse? So one idea we've proposed is that's coming from the motor system. Not the part of the motor system that actually moves our body, but the part of the motor system that plans our movements. So you can think of it really as a collaboration between the auditory system, which processes the sound coming in, and the motor system, which we know is great at creating rhythmic patterns. The motor system is essentially providing that scaffolding or template around which we perceive sound. So we think that motor activity is actually playing a causal role in enabling us to hear patterns of sound. What if the brain is taking advantage of that internal temporal representation and using that to actually shape perception? So here's an example. If I make
Rhythm,
a sound like
enabling personal music appreciation. Rhythm, catalyzing human group cohesion. But because music is a whole brain activity, John sees music in general, and rhythm in particular, as key to what makes us human. How does the brain do it? What are the brain structures and pathways? How much of the brain is engaged in music? To explore how the brain makes music, I meet a neurologist and a songwriter who uses his lifelong passion for music to study the brain, Mark Jude Tramo.
Well, it all starts with the ear, of course. The sound strikes our tympanic membrane. That vibration, energy gets sent to fluid in the inner ear. The fluid in the inner ear causes a membrane called the basilar membrane to move. That in turn has a hair cell, an inner hair cell that's sitting on top of the membrane that bumps its hair up against another membrane. And when that hair bends, ion channels open, and that's where the electrochemical signaling becomes. So we have a mechanical to electrical transduction happening at the level of the sensory receptor. Then the hair cells receive one axon from a spiral ganglion cell that's a bipolar cell. So it sends it out to the ear, the spiral ganglion cell, and then another arm to the brainstem. So it's connecting the ear to the brainstem, and that connection here, the auditory nerve on this side, that's an obligatory pathway. What's remarkable is we have to realize you're hearing me talk now. There are no sound waves in your brain. The sound waves stop in this membrane that's fluctuating, and they get encoded in electrochemical signals. So it's almost all a hallucination. And we're actually hearing things generated by neurons in the system that are firing action potentials, and it's coded in the action potentials. So once the signal gets to the brain and the brain stem, then there's a lot more processing, of course, that goes on. And I happen today to have brought a brain for us.
Great, that brings back memories. Looks familiar.
So the input is to the lower part here of the brain stem, a part of it known as the medulla, where the cochlear nucleus is. So that spiral ganglion cell's central axon goes into the cochlear nucleus. And from there are 5 different stations before it gets up to the cerebral cortex. So we think that the conscious perception of sound takes shape up here in the superior temporal cortex, where the neurons are selective for sound as opposed to light and touch, or immediately below in the thalamus in the medial genicular new. So that's when we really become aware, and it takes over 10 milliseconds to get there. We know that it is within the brain that information from the 2 ears gets integrated. That doesn't happen out in the periphery, and that gets elaborated on as it goes up. Amazingly, there are multiple crossings, 3 or 4 crossings between the left and right side. So the 2 sides are actually talking to each other all the way up. And as cognitive neuroscience,
The various centers of the brain's auditory system are well known, and the multiple levels of integration and association give insight into how sound waves in the air produce sound perceptions in the mind. But be not befuddled. Fancy names do not mean that we understand how the brain makes music, how sparks of neurons yield the mystical experience of music. The deep challenge is to associate what we sense in our minds with what neuroscientists discover in our brains. But because music is so complex, we must use simplifying tricks to do science. For example, by using super simple auditory input, or by using musical illusions to make the familiar strange. I speak with a pioneer in the psychology of music, the author of Musical Illusions and Phantom Words, How Music and Speech Unlock the Mysteries of the Brain, Diana Deutsch. Diana, in your work, pioneering work in understanding the psychology and cognitive science of music, the fundamental question is, how does the brain recognize music?
Well, a lot of the work has been the discovery of a number of illusions. If you compare, for example, vision, you can scrutinize a visual scene. You can look in the upper left, you can just look a little further to the right and so on. You can take your time, you can scrutinize it. But you can't do that with music. It just goes by you so fast. So in point of fact, the brain has a hard time with music. The visual system has as its front end 125 million photoreceptors. In comparison, the auditory system has only 15,500 receptors in the ear, and only 3,500 of those send information up to the cortex. And I think that that's because it's kind of pretty hopeless to attempt to really apprehend what's happening because it's going by so fast. And the brain makes up for it by having a very tortuous set of pathways. So there's a pathway up to the cortex, but then there's also pathways down from the cortex to, say, the next way station down, and then the next way station down, and so on, all the way back to the ear. And so you have a very elaborate feedback mechanism, and at each point along the pathway, some processing occurs. So that really enables us to apprehend music, but that does mean that the brain produces an enormous amount of input into what we perceive where music is concerned. And I think it's probably more than is the case on vision. Now, of course, optical illusions are well known, whereas illusions of music really are not. I can play you one example showing the importance of the input from the brain, our memories, our expectations, our beliefs, and so on, in what we hear. I'll play you a well-known tune, and I guarantee that you know this tune. The only thing is that the notes have been placed randomly in 3 different octaves, even though the note names are the same. So every C is really a C, every D is really a D, and so on. But the C could be middle C, or it could be the C an octave above, or it could be the C an octave below. And it had been believed at the time that that didn't matter, that you could simply process what music theorists call pitch class. So let me play you this tune and see if you can recognize it. So then the audience should name that tune. And I can guarantee you that it's very, very rare for anyone to be able to name it. And this is true of very expert musicians as well as people without musical training. Okay, now here is the tune with all the tones played in the same octave.
Yeah, it's so obvious.
Okay. Now, the interesting thing is, now that you know what the tune is, so you know what to listen for, you can then follow each note as it occurs and then place it in the same octave as the other notes. And so that way you're using what psychologists call top-down processing in order to recognize the tune. So here is the same as the one you just heard. Now, some people get it right away. For other people, you have to play it a few times, and they always get it. I'll play it one more time, though.
Yeah, I could see it becoming more familiar now that I've heard it. Yeah.
Yes.
And so what that shows is that there is information coming from higher levels down to lower levels.
Exactly. We're drawing on our long-term memory for tunes that we know and matching what we're hearing with that long-term memory. Right. And so we have no problem in the end recognizing it. In fact, I'm so familiar with this that now I have to think, am I playing the one that's all in the same octave or the one that's in...
That is a really psychophysical demonstration of the anatomical efferent pathways.
It must be. It must be,
It's really remarkable.
Auditory illusions are startling because they prove the power of top-down information altering raw sensory perception. What we have heard in the past alters what we hear in the present. It almost makes me an anti-realist skeptic, not believing anything I hear. But I must accept that what I perceive as music must be truly personal. But how can we discover how music makes actual changes in the brain? I speak with the director of the Music Cognition Lab at Princeton, a psychologist, pianist, and author of On Repeat, How Music Plays the Mind, Elizabeth Margulies. I ask Elizabeth, what is it about music such that the same kind or even same piece of music will affect people in radically different ways?
David Huron uses this wonderful example of a decade during which Frank Sinatra was used as punishment in detention, right? And you can imagine other times when that would have been an attraction. So clearly there's not something intrinsic about certain sequences of sound and their effect on people, right? Rather, we're bringing a whole host of predictions and modes of understanding from the kinds of experiences and enculturation we've had previously in our life. Various kinds of atonal music, which reads to listeners who've been enculturated to the Western tonal system. They'll tell you it sounds often like horror or murder or paranoia. Whereas we take the same music to places with different scale structures, and they'll tell you the exact same excerpt sounds like happily skating with their friends or going into the mountains to play.
Can you see any changes in the brain, locations in the brain in the two different situations?
One thing that we know is that we see more activation in reward circuitry to music that's familiar. So this is aligning with the effects of repetition as well. Because part of what enculturation is repetition, is having been exposed and re-exposed to certain kinds of patterns.
Beth, in understanding how brains make music, what are some future directions?
I think it's become increasingly clear that it's not a model where we have a part of the brain that deals with music and it's kind of orphaned and cut off from everything else. In fact, it's pretty much the opposite. We see that when people are listening, even just listening to music, not even making music themselves, that there's this incredible choreography between all kinds of different brain regions. So if you think about what you're doing when you're listening to, or let's say making music, there's sophisticated cognitive processing as you're tracking the structure of what you're listening to and remembering what you heard previously and calling on long-term memory. There's emotional engagement, right? And there's all kinds of other modalities that are really important. So people, it turns out, are roughly as good at telling you how big an interval is, right? A musical jump between two pitches, when they're just looking at an image of someone singing those intervals as they are when they're actually listening to them. So there's this really tight intertwining between what you're seeing and what you're hearing and what you're remembering. So what that means for future research is that there's really important partnerships that need to happen between different methods. So for example, not only looking at what's happening in the brain when you're listening to sound, but also when you're engaged physically with what you're listening to. So people are starting to use motion capture and eye tracking and more really situated real world kinds of approaches. I think that's one of the really interesting areas of this corner of research, is that there's this feedback between what's happening in the art and what's happening in the science. So if you have a bunch of people listening to the same piece, if you look at the moments when their brains are doing the same thing, those are the moments that the music is capturing them. It's music driven, right? Because if their brains are doing different things, they could be thinking about what they're having for lunch, or they're just not as gripped by what they're listening to. So it can be a great way of probing how music captures attention. Great example there is the Washington Post reporter who put Joshua Bell in the Washington, D.C. subway system, right? So this amazing violinist, people will pay lots of money to go hear him perform and have these riveting experiences, yet he was down there for some elaborate amount of time, right? And very few people cared. He made like $30 or something, and all told. And so we wanted to try to figure out what was going on there. And so we actually put people in an fMRI scanner, and we couldn't take the same violinist and put him in the subway or not. So our proxy was just telling people, now you're going to hear a performance by a conservatory student of piano, or now you're going to hear a performance by a world-renowned concert pianist.
And did you get a difference?
Yes. Not only did people tell you they liked the performance better when they thought it was a professional, even when it was just the same performance, but you could see all this reward circuitry actually starting during the priming period when we told them that they were going to hear a professional. What they were able to perceptually access was really dependent on the frame that we'd provided them.
So it's really an active participation that we have in the music.
Absolutely.
Describing the human experience, music comes high on the list. That music comes from the brain brings no surprise, but how the brain experiences and appreciates music probes both brain mechanisms and human consciousness and cultural anthropology as well. Rhythm may be the foundation of music. Linked to the brain's motor system and language, rhythm may have facilitated the cohesion of human groups. The hierarchical beauty of the auditory pathways snaking up the brain contrasts with the almost hallucinatory experience of hearing music, when astonishingly all that is really going on are fluctuating membranes and electrochemical signals. Startling auditory illusions
prove that what we think we hear are not pure sounds out there in the world, mind independent, but rather top-down influence sounds, the product of prior experience. While diverse cultures produce different, even opposite reactions to similar musical sounds, similar reactions to different musical sounds are expressed by similar locations and activities in diverse brains. Music and brain have an explanatory relationship that is reciprocal. In the next episode, we flip the direction of the explanatory arrow. We ask how music facilitates understanding brain or mind. We need both explanatory directions to get closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.